You know, sometimes the quiet ones are the ones carrying the heaviest secrets. And my grandfather, Elias Thorne, he was about as quiet as they come. He was the kind of man who'd sit on his porch swing for 3 hours straight, just watching the pine trees grow in the Maine fog, and say maybe 10 words the whole time. When Elias died, it wasn't a shock. He was 92, his ticker was tired, and he'd lived a good long life out on that remote property near Bangor. But even though we expected it, the silence he left behind felt enormous. I'm Alex. I was his only grandson, and honestly, Elias and I were close. Not in a loud, high-fiving way, but in that deep, solid way where you just know the other person has your back. So, when the lawyer called me into his office in Portland 2 weeks after the funeral, I wasn't expecting much, besides a couple of old fishing reels and maybe his dusty leather armchair. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, was a stiff man with a bow tie that looked like it was choking him. He went through the standard formalities, reading Elias's last wishes in a low drone. It was all pretty standard stuff. Small cash amounts to a few charities, instructions for his burial plot. Then, Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and slid a thick, yellowed envelope across the mahogany desk. "Alex," he said, adjusting his glasses, "your grandfather left you the house, the entire property, 140 acres of woodland, including the structure and everything on it." My jaw nearly hit the floor. That land wasn't just a house, it was a slice of wilderness, miles from the nearest paved road. It was everything Elias had ever cared about. "Thank you," I managed, feeling a sudden lump in my throat. I hadn't realized how much I needed a fresh start, and that old place, despite its isolation, felt like home. Mr. Henderson continued, his voice dropping slightly. "There is also this. It was sealed inside the main will document, with instructions that you were to read it alone, after you received the deed." He pointed to the heavy envelope. It wasn't typed. It was addressed to me in Elias's familiar, shaky cursive. The ink was faded like he'd written it years ago. I pocketed the letter, signed the stack of papers, and drove straight out of Portland, heading north toward the coast and then inland, away from the hustle. I needed to see the place, to feel the dirt under my boots, to finally read what my grandfather had to say. It took me 4 hours to get there. The final mile was a winding dirt track, barely wide enough for my old pickup. The house itself stood exactly as I remembered it, a sturdy, dark wood farmhouse, weathering the harsh Maine winters, surrounded by towering pines that filtered the afternoon sun into long, shadowy stripes. It smelled like pine needles, damp earth, and memories. I sat down on the old porch swing, the one Elias used to spend hours on, and finally tore open the letter. The paper inside was brittle and the handwriting was definitely Elias's, but it was much neater than his usual quick scrawl, suggesting he'd taken his time writing this. It started exactly how you'd expect, a rambling, loving farewell. He talked about how proud he was of me, how he hoped I'd find peace on the land, and how the old place needed a good, strong pair of hands to fix it up. Then the tone shifted. The familiar, warm voice of my grandfather suddenly became tight, almost clinical. The handwriting got smaller, pressed hard into the paper. "Alex, my boy, I have protected this property for 50 years, not just from the elements, but from things that might try to take what's hidden here. I know you're smart and I know you're curious. That's why I have to be absolutely clear about one thing. This is not a suggestion. This is a command, and you must treat it like the last words I will ever speak to you." I leaned forward, the swing creaking beneath me. My heart was starting to thump hard against my ribs. What in the world was he talking about? "Do whatever you need to do to the house, fix the roof, paint the walls, tear out the kitchen. But regarding the land, remember this. You can dig, you can plant trees, you can put in a garden, you can lay new pipe for the well, but you are never, ever, under any circumstances, to dig past 10 feet. 10 feet. That was the magic number. I read the sentence 3 times, trying to find a logical explanation. Was it an old septic tank? An underground spring? Buried power lines? But the tone wasn't a warning about utility maintenance. It was a plea rooted in pure dread. He continued, 10 feet. That is the limit. If you go deeper, you will find something that was meant to stay buried. You will unleash something I spent half my life keeping safe, and the consequences will be catastrophic, not just for you, but for the world outside the fence line. Promise me, Alex, on everything we ever shared, you never dig past 10 feet. If you respect my wishes in this one thing, the land will be yours, and you will be safe. If you break this promise, everything changes. The letter ended abruptly, signed simply, Elias. I sat there for a long time, the letter crumpled in my hand, listening to the wind sigh through the pines. It was so dramatic, so out of character for the reserved man I knew. Was he losing his mind toward the end? Was this the rambling of an old man obsessed with some local legend? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he buried something valuable, old gold, maybe war bonds, and didn't want me to risk hitting bedrock or causing a cave-in. But the language about catastrophic consequences and unleash something sounded like something out of a bad horror movie, not a practical will. For the first few weeks, I obeyed him. I moved into the house, which needed serious work. The plumbing was shot, the electrical wiring was a fire hazard, and the basement smelled like a swamp. I spent my days tearing out rotten drywall and wrestling with rusty pipes. I hired a local contractor, a big guy named Dale, to help me tackle the big stuff. Dale was useful, and more importantly, he knew the history of the area. I tried to casually ask him about the property's past. "This place?" Dale grunted one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's always been the Thorn place, quiet. Your grandpa Elias, he was a mystery, though, kept to himself. Folks around here used to say he was hiding something." "Hiding what?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Dale shrugged, tossing a piece of scrap wood onto the burn pile. "Who knows? He worked off the property for years, way down south, before he came back here in the 60s. Never talked about it. Just bought this land, put up a big fence and settled in. Acted like the world ended right at his driveway." That detail stuck with me. Elias hadn't always been the quiet Maine woodsman. He had a life, a career, somewhere else before he retreated here. What had he done? And why did he choose this remote patch of earth to finish his life? The problem with inheriting a house built in the 1940s is that eventually you have to deal with the septic system. And Elias's system wasn't just old, it was actively failing. I needed a new one, placed far away from the house, and that meant digging. I called the county for the permits. The plans required a large trench, roughly 6 feet deep, to lay the main pipes and the drainage field. 6 feet. That was well within the 10-foot limit. I felt a surge of relief. I could fix the property without breaking my promise. But I wasn't satisfied. The more I thought about that letter, the more Elias's face haunted me. He wasn't a practical joker. He was genuinely scared of whatever lay beneath his land. And if he took that much care to write that warning, then he had to have buried something truly significant. Something worth breaking the law for. Or maybe something that the government itself would want. The contractor arrived a week later, with a massive yellow excavator. The sheer size of the machine felt like a betrayal of Elias's peace. Dale and his crew started working on the designated spot, about 100 yards behind the barn. The earth was soft and easy to turn, mostly just pine needles and damp topsoil. By the end of the first day, they had the main trench dug, 6 feet deep, nothing but dirt, rocks, and ancient roots. "Looks good, Alex," Dale called out, climbing down from the cab of the excavator. "We'll be laying the pipe tomorrow." That night I couldn't sleep. I walked out to the edge of the woods and stood looking at the fresh, raw trench. 6 feet. The hole looked deep enough to swallow a car, but my mind kept calculating the remaining distance. 4 feet. That was the distance between the safe, permissible depth and the line Elias had drawn in the sand. 4 feet of dirt separated me from the secret he died protecting. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. It's a gnawing itch right behind your eyes, and once it starts, you can't scratch it hard enough. I kept telling myself, he was old. He was senile. It's just an old, broken oil tank. But the phrase kept echoing. You will unleash something I spent half my life keeping safe. The next morning, I was supposed to meet Dale at 8 a.m. I got up at 5 a.m. before the sun was fully up and made a pot of strong coffee. I walked out to the barn where Dale had left the excavator parked overnight. I stared at the heavy machinery. I had never operated anything bigger than a riding lawnmower, but I had watched Dale closely. It was simple mechanics, levers and pedals. I climbed up into the cab. It smelled like diesel and sweat. I found the ignition key hanging on the dash, right where Dale had left it. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was just going to test the controls. Just a little practice. The engine roared to life, shaking the quiet morning air. I moved the massive machine slowly, carefully, over to the existing trench. The bucket, a scoop of heavy steel teeth, looked terrifying. I lowered the bucket, sinking it into the soft earth at the bottom of the 6-foot hole. I moved the controls, pulling the lever back toward me. The bucket bit into the soil, tearing up another 2 feet of ground. 8 feet. I stopped, the engine idling loudly. The hole was now terrifyingly deep. I felt a cold knot of guilt in my stomach. I was already breaking my promise. I was already defying the last wishes of the only man who truly understood me. I looked around the clearing. The pines stood silent, judging me. "Just 2 more feet, Alex." That's what the voice in my head whispered. "You've come this far. What's 2 more feet? Prove he was just crazy." I pushed the guilt down, replacing it with the adrenaline of pure investigation. I was going to find out what was so terrifying about the number 10. I lowered the bucket again. The ground was getting denser now, the dirt heavy with clay. I had to push the hydraulics harder. 9 feet. The excavator groaned under the strain. I could feel the vibrations shaking the entire machine. 9.5 feet. I was scraping the bottom of the forbidden zone. I pulled the lever one last time, forcing the bucket down. The teeth screeched against something hard. Not bedrock, but something else, something solid and flat. Clang. The sound was sharp and metallic, totally different from the dull thud of rock or the tearing sound of roots. I cut the engine immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. I jumped out of the cab and ran to the edge of the hole. I looked down into the shadowy 10-foot deep trench. The bottom was obscured by loose dirt, but right where the bucket had struck I could see a dark, smooth surface. It was perfectly level. It wasn't a natural formation. It wasn't a pipe. It was manufactured. I grabbed the shovel I had left near the barn and clambered down into the hole. The air was colder down there, damp and still. I knelt, scraping away the loose clay with the edge of the shovel. The surface I uncovered wasn't rust-colored or brittle like old metal. It was thick, dark green, almost black. It felt like treated steel, designed to withstand immense pressure. I cleared off a larger area. The object was massive, flat on top, and extended far beyond the edges of the trench. It was huge. I tapped it with the handle of the shovel. It resonated with a deep, hollow sound. I had done it. I had dug past 10 feet and I had found something my grandfather desperately wanted to keep hidden. I dug further down the side of the object, trying to find an edge. After another foot of digging, I finally exposed the vertical side. It wasn't just a plate. It was the lid of something. A container. And it was sealed tight. Not with a simple bolt or lock, but with heavy-duty industrial welding, like it hadn't been opened since the day it was lowered into the ground. As the sun began to peek over the trees, casting long, pale light into the hole, I saw something else stamped into the thick green metal just beneath the seal. It wasn't a logo or a brand name. It was a series of letters and numbers, stenciled in stark white paint, now faded but still legible. U.S. Gov property, classified, do not open. My grandfather hadn't buried his life savings. He hadn't buried junk. He had buried evidence, and he had buried it deep beneath his quiet little farm in rural Maine. I stood there, covered in mud, 10 feet below the surface, staring at a military-grade secret. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the moment I broke that seal, I would be dragging myself and Elias's legacy into a dangerous world he had spent 50 years trying to escape. I had found the 10-foot line, and what lay beneath it was far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The silence that followed the clang was worse than any roar. It wasn't the natural silence of the Maine woods. It was a profound, heavy quiet, the kind that holds its breath. Alex stood there, 10 feet down, the mud cold on his face, staring at the stark white lettering, U.S. Gov property, classified, do not open. This wasn't some eccentric old man's prank. This was real. This was a national secret buried beneath the pine needles of his quiet inherited farm. Panic hit him in a suffocating wave. Dale, the contractor, was due in less than 3 hours. If Dale or anyone saw that stamp, Alex's life would be over, or at least entirely out of his hands. Elias's warning wasn't just about the danger of the contents, it was about the danger of the discovery itself. Alex scrambled out of the trench, his muscles burning. He didn't hesitate. He jumped back into the cab of the excavator, the engine still warm. He had to hide it. Now. He worked the levers with frantic desperation, scooping up the loose dirt he'd just excavated and dumping it back into the hole. He was careful, though, making sure to bury the classified markings first. He piled the earth high, burying the dark green container under a thick blanket of clay and topsoil. He needed to make the trench look exactly like what it was supposed to be. A failed attempt at digging a septic line. He worked until the sun was fully up, turning the grey mist into a bright, deceptive morning. By the time he was done, the hole was still deep, maybe 8 feet, but the bottom was covered in loose debris, obscuring the precise depth and, crucially, hiding the metal lid. He parked the excavator exactly where Dale had left it, wiped the mud and sweat from his face, and walked back to the house, trying to slow his pounding heart. He was pouring his 3rd cup of coffee when he heard the rumble of Dale's heavy-duty pickup turning onto the dirt track. "Morning, Alex," Dale shouted, climbing out of his truck, already chewing on a cigar. He strode over to the trench, squinting down into the shadows. "Whoa, you had a busy morning, didn't you?" Alex forced a casual shrug. "Yeah, sorry about that, Dale. Couldn't resist testing out the big boy." He tried to keep his voice level, injecting a little false bravado. "Turns out I'm terrible at it. I went way too deep and I hit something massive." "Bedrock?" Dale asked, scratching his beard. "No, not bedrock," Alex lied easily, remembering the metallic clang. It felt huge, like a slab of granite the size of a minivan. "I think we're going to have to move the septic field 20 feet west, or we'll need dynamite to get through that thing." Dale eyed the trench skeptically. "A slab that big? That's some weird geology, Alex, but all right, we'll shift the plans. Saves me hauling the heavy drill out here today." The relief Alex felt was physically painful. He had bought himself time. Dale spent the rest of the morning clearing brush in the new location, completely unaware that 8 feet below the dirt in the abandoned trench lay a secret that could shatter Alex's world. As soon as Dale left for lunch, Alex walked back to the hole. The earth was silent again. He knew he couldn't leave it buried. Thalias had warned him not to dig past 10 feet, but now that Alex knew why, the curiosity had transformed into a crushing responsibility. He wasn't just guarding some eccentric family treasure. He was sitting on a government secret, possibly something dangerous. He waited until dusk. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and purple, Alex grabbed a strong rope, a headlamp, and a small heavy-duty pickaxe. He climbed carefully back down into the trench, the air growing colder and damper with every foot he descended. When he reached the bottom, he spent an hour carefully clearing the dirt until the massive steel lid was fully exposed again. The container was enormous. It wasn't a standard locker or a drum. It was a vault. The seams where the lid met the body of the container were welded shut with such precision that they looked seamless. Alex ran his gloved hand over the chilled metal. He pointed his headlamp along the side, searching for any other markings. Near the bottom corner, etched deeply into the steel, he found a smaller, almost hidden inscription. It wasn't painted. It was carved with a tool, perhaps a cutting torch, and then quickly covered over. He wiped away the grit and read the faint lettering. Project Chimera, 1968. The year 1968. That was the year Elias had suddenly abandoned his life down south and retreated to this remote Maine property, buying the land and putting up that imposing fence. Project Chimera. The name sounded mythological, but the implication was terrifyingly real. Chimera, a creature made of disparate, often monstrous parts. Alex climbed out of the hole, his mind racing. He had reached the limit of what he could discover with a shovel and a pickaxe. If he was going to understand what was inside, he needed to understand who Elias Thorne had been before he became the quiet man on the porch swing. The house, despite its age, was surprisingly organized. Elias had been meticulous, but he had never allowed Alex into the small study off the living room. It was always locked, even when Alex visited as a child. Alex went straight there. He tried the handle. Locked, of course. He found Elias's old skeleton keyring, a heavy brass collection of keys that must have dated back 50 years. After 15 frustrating minutes, a small dark key slid into the lock and turned with a satisfying click. The study smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, even though Elias hadn't smoked in decades. It was a simple room, a sturdy oak desk, a wall of books filled with dusty science and engineering texts, and a worn leather chair. Alex started with the desk. The drawers were mostly filled with utility bills and old tax returns, but the center drawer stuck. He pulled harder, and when it finally gave way, a small section of the wood paneling inside the drawer slid forward slightly. A false bottom. His hands were shaking as he lifted the thin piece of wood. Beneath it lay a small collection of items, wrapped tightly in a thick oilskin cloth. 1. A heavy, brass ID card, the kind that looked like it would survive a nuclear blast. The photo was of a young Elias, maybe 30 years old, clean-shaven, his eyes sharp and serious. The title beneath his name read, Chief Structural Engineer, Department of Advanced Containment, DAC. The location stamped on the bottom was a place Alex had never heard of, the Obsidian Complex, Nevada. 2. A small, leather-bound journal. 3. A faded black and white photograph. Alex picked up the photo first. It was a group shot, taken perhaps outside a sterile, windowless building. Elias was in the center, flanked by 5 other men and 1 woman, all wearing lab coats, looking tired but triumphant. They looked like people who had just finished something monumental, something dangerous. The back of the photo was scrawled with a single hasty note in Elias's familiar hand. The team. Before everything went south. 10:68. He turned to the journal. The leather was soft with age, and the pages were thin, filled with Elias's small, precise handwriting. It wasn't a diary of emotions. It was a technical log, interspersed with personal notes. Alex flipped through the first few pages, his eyes scanning the dense jargon. It was filled with diagrams, pressure calculations, and references to materials science. Entry 14, April 1968. Containment Phase 1, complete. The thermal signature remains stable, but the internal pressure fluctuations are concerning. Subject 0 is proving far more resilient than projected. We must increase the shielding efficacy by 300%. Entry 35, August 1968. The incident. We lost 3 men, not from radiation but from the breach itself. The sheer kinetic force when the shell failed was unbelievable. They underestimated the stabilization phase. The entire facility is compromised. They want to bury it. They want to bury all of it. Alex's breath hitched. Bury it. That was exactly what Elias had done. He flipped further, finding the entries that described the frantic aftermath. Entry 41, September 1968. The directive is simple, total erasure. They are calling it Deep Storage Protocol, but it's a cover-up. They are moving the core elements out of Obsidian and dispersing them. I was tasked with the structural integrity of the main dispersal unit, the most volatile piece. They want it gone, far from the jurisdiction of the desert. It must be isolated, structurally sound and forgotten. The location must be untraceable. Entry 44, October 1968, the last entry in the journal. I chose the main property, remote, high water table, deep clay layer, perfect isolation. I oversaw the transport myself. We lowered the unit 12 feet down, past the frost line, past the natural earth density. I sealed it personally. I used the new titanium alloy on the welds. Nothing short of a military-grade acetylene torch will penetrate it. It must stay dormant. If the seal fails, or if anyone attempts to retrieve it, the pressure release will be catastrophic. I am leaving. I am becoming Elias Thorne, the quiet woodsman. I will guard the land until my last breath. The only warning I can leave my boy is the depth. 10 feet. That is the limit of safety. Below that lies the Chimera. Alex let the journal fall onto the desk. The quiet house felt suddenly enormous and terrifyingly small. He hadn't inherited a piece of land. He had inherited a bomb, a military-grade container holding the most volatile component of a failed, classified government experiment, Project Chimera. And his grandfather wasn't a recluse. He was the self-appointed lifelong guardian of a secret burial site. The full weight of Elias's last letter crashed over him. "You will unleash something I spent half my life keeping safe, and the consequences will be catastrophic." Elias hadn't been senile. He had been a man terrified of the past catching up to the present. He hadn't just buried evidence. He had buried the ticking time clock of his own failure to contain Subject Zero. Alex looked at the ID card, Chief Structural Engineer. Elias knew exactly how the container was built and exactly how to destroy it or keep it safe. The immediate question wasn't what was inside, but how to deal with the knowledge. If the government, the DAC, had gone to such lengths to bury this, they would stop at nothing to ensure it remained buried. And Alex, by digging, had just put himself on their radar, whether he knew it or not. He felt a sudden desperate need to see the container again, to understand the dimensions of his problem. He needed to know if the titanium welds Elias had mentioned were truly impenetrable. That night, Alex hardly slept. He organized the papers, hiding them back beneath the false bottom. He realized he needed professional help, but who could he trust with a story this insane? A lawyer, a journalist? Either path would lead straight to federal investigation and probably Alex disappearing into a black site. He decided he had to rely on Elias's expertise. Elias had built the vault, and Elias's journal likely contained the key to understanding its weakness or its stability. The next morning, Alex woke up with a grim determination. He couldn't just stand guard like Elias had done for 50 years. He had broken the promise. He had disturbed the peace. He needed to know if the container was stable. He needed to get inside. If Elias said only a military-grade torch could open it, that meant Alex had a serious problem. He wasn't going to drag industrial welding equipment out to a hidden trench. But there had to be another way. Engineers always design a fail-safe, or at least a point of access. Alex pulled out the journal again, focusing on the highly technical diagrams. Page after page of schematics for the deep storage unit, detailing insulation layers, pressure valves, and the unique locking mechanism. Elias had been thorough. The lid wasn't just welded, it was keyed. There was a small high-pressure access port, designed to allow periodic monitoring of the internal atmosphere without compromising the main seal. This port was located exactly 12 feet down, on the container's side panel. Alex felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with dread. That port was his way in. It was small, maybe 6 inches wide, and secured by 3 heavy-duty hexagonal bolts that looked like they hadn't moved since 1968. He had the tools. He had the location. But as he looked at the diagram, he noticed a final, crucial note scribbled in the margin next to the access port schematic. Warning: external pressure release must be zeroed before bolts are turned. Failure to follow protocol will result in immediate catastrophic decompression and dispersion of contents. Do not open without level 4 containment gear. Alex didn't have level 4 containment gear. He barely had a pair of work gloves. He was going 12 feet deep, into a hole, to manually open a pressure valve on a military container labeled classified, holding the volatile component of Project Chimera. He was risking total catastrophic dispersion based on a 50-year-old journal. He grabbed the biggest wrench he owned, a socket set and his rope. It was time to dig again. But this time he wasn't looking for a secret. He was looking for the truth, no matter how deadly. Alex grabbed the biggest wrench he owned, a socket set, and his rope. It was time to dig again. But this time, he wasn't looking for a secret. He was looking for the truth, no matter how deadly. The sun had been down for hours, and the main woods were pitch black save for the narrow beam of Alex's headlamp. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rasp of his breathing and the scrape of the shovel. He had to deepen the trench, not just to expose the top of the container, but to get down to the side panel, 12 feet below the surface. He hated the excavator now. It was too loud, too conspicuous. He worked slowly, manually, scooping out the dirt and tossing it up onto the lip of the trench. Clay, rocks, and damp earth rained down on him as he worked, coating him in a heavy, cold grime. The air down there was thick and smelled ancient. It took him nearly 3 hours of grueling labor, his muscles screaming, before he finally cleared enough space to kneel beside the massive dark green vault. He shone his light on the side panel. Just as the journal had shown, there was a small circular plate, maybe 8 inches across. This was the access port. It was held in place by 3 massive hexagonal bolts, thick as his thumb, sunk deep into the steel. They looked utterly immovable, locked in place by 50 years of pressure and rust. Alex remembered Elias's warning. Failure to follow protocol will result in immediate catastrophic decompression and dispersion of contents. He sat back on his heels, the cold metal radiating through his work pants. What was the protocol? The journal didn't detail it, only warned against ignoring it. Did he need to equalize the pressure somehow? Was there a hidden valve? He traced the outline of the bolts with his finger. They were sealed with what looked like a thick black epoxy, another layer of protection Elias must have added. "Well, Elias," Alex whispered into the hole, his voice sounding thin and weak, "if you wanted me to leave it alone, you shouldn't have left me the map." He pulled out the largest socket wrench and fitted it over the first bolt. The fit was perfect. He took a deep, shaky breath, braced his feet against the side of the container, and pulled. Nothing. The wrench strained, the heavy steel handle bending slightly, but the bolt didn't budge. He pulled again, putting every ounce of his weight into it, gritting his teeth until his jaw ached. Screech. The sound of grinding metal was deafening in the confined space. A shower of rust flakes dusted his face. The bolt moved, maybe a quarter turn. Alex paused, listening. He expected a hiss, a sudden drop in temperature, some sign that the internal pressure was reacting. Nothing, just the deep, dead silence of the earth. He repeated the process on the second bolt. This one was easier, turning with a painful, drawn-out groan. As he moved to the third bolt, his hands slippery with sweat and mud, he started to feel something strange. A faint vibration. Not the vibration of the wrench, but something coming from deep inside the vault. It was extremely subtle, like a very low, slow heartbeat. Thump. Thump. It could have been his imagination, fueled by adrenaline and fear. But Elias's warning about Subject Zero being far more resilient than projected flashed through his mind. Alex ignored the tremor, or tried to. He had to finish this. He put the wrench on the final bolt. He pulled, harder than before. Crack. The bolt finally broke free, not just turning, but snapping the last of the epoxy seal. Alex instinctively threw himself against the wall of the trench, shielding his face with his arm, waiting for the catastrophic decompression. He waited for the pressurized air, the volatile contents, the dispersion that was supposed to tear him apart. But there was no explosion, no violent hiss. There was only a soft, dull clunk. As the small circular access plate shifted slightly inward, held in place by the residual vacuum of the seal. Alex lowered his arm, heart hammering. He slowly reached out and touched the plate. It was cold. He grabbed the edge and pulled. The plate came away with surprising ease. He held the access port cover in his hand, staring into the small, dark hole he had just created in a 50-year-old military-grade secret vault. He was expecting to see pressurized gas, or perhaps a thick, glowing sludge. Instead, the hole was dark, and the air that wafted out was dry, cool, and oddly metallic. It smelled less like corrosion and more like a battery acid mixed with ozone. He aimed his headlamp into the cavity. The access port opened into a small, narrow chamber, maybe a foot deep, leading to the main interior of the vault. And the first thing Alex saw was not a void, but a small secondary object wedged perfectly into the port chamber. It was a cylinder, about the size of a Coke can, made of some dull silver-grey metal. It was tethered to the back wall of the chamber by a thin, reinforced cable. Alex carefully reached in and pulled the cylinder out. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked, and felt cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so. His grandfather, the chief structural engineer, hadn't just buried a problem, he had left a message. He examined the cylinder. It wasn't a bomb. It was clearly a piece of monitoring equipment, though unlike anything Alex had ever seen. There was a small integrated screen on the side, barely an inch wide, made of thick, yellowed glass. Alex pressed a tiny recessed button on the side. The screen flickered to life, showing 3 lines of green digital text. The top line was a date. 10/14/T, 1968. The date of Elias's last journal entry. The second line was a reading. Pressure 00 psi static. The third line made Alex's blood run cold. Contents, status, integrity compromised. The catastrophic decompression hadn't happened right now. It had happened sometime between 1968 and today. The vault was no longer sealed. Whatever volatile pressure had existed was gone. Alex looked back into the open port. Now that the secondary cylinder was removed, he could see deeper into the vault. The cavity opened into the main storage area. He maneuvered his headlamp to peer inside. The vault was big, maybe 10 feet long and 6 feet wide. It wasn't empty. In the center of the vault, resting on a specialized cradle that looked like it was designed to absorb immense shock, was the main component. It wasn't a glowing barrel or a liquid or a gas. It was a shape. It was roughly spherical, maybe 4 feet in diameter, covered in a complex woven mesh of black fibrous material that looked organic and synthetic at the same time. The mesh was stretched tight over whatever was inside, like a heavy industrial cocoon. But the surface wasn't smooth. It was wrinkled, cracked, and at one point the black mesh was clearly ripped, torn open like a wound. And through that tear, Alex could see what lay beneath. It wasn't metal. It wasn't rock. It was something that shimmered faintly, even under the harsh glare of his headlamp. It was the color of deep twilight, a shifting, oily purple-black with veins of something that looked like dull silver running through it. It didn't reflect light. It seemed to absorb it. And worst of all, the surface wasn't static. It was pulsing. Very slowly. Thump. Thump. The faint vibration Alex had felt earlier wasn't the machinery. It was the contents. Whatever Subject Zero was, it was alive, or at least it was reacting. Alex scrambled backward, climbing out of the hole faster than he had climbed down. He didn't care about the rope or the tools. He just needed air. He collapsed onto the damp earth at the edge of the trench, clutching the small monitoring cylinder in his hand. The container wasn't holding in pressure, it was holding in life, and the seal was already compromised. If the integrity was compromised and the pressure was zero, it meant 2 things. First, the immediate danger of an explosion was gone. Second, whatever was inside had adapted to the external environment. It had survived the breach. He looked down at the small screen on the monitoring device. He pressed the button again, rotating through the display menus. Most of it was encrypted technical jargon, but one screen was labeled Atmospheric Readings, Current. The internal temperature of the vault was exactly 78 degrees Fahrenheit, unusually warm for a hole 12 feet deep in Maine. And the final line, the one that made his stomach drop out. External air exchange, 100% slow flow. The breach wasn't just a crack. It was an active connection to the outside world. Whatever was trapped in the vault was now exchanging air with the forest above. Alex had to seal the hole, immediately. He didn't care about the truth anymore. He cared about containment. He shoved the monitor cylinder into his pocket and, ignoring the metallic stench, forced himself back down into the trench. He carefully placed the access plate back over the hole, pressing it firmly into the thick, dried epoxy residue. He couldn't re-weld it, but he could make it look secure. He used the largest rock he could lift down there and wedged it against the plate for added pressure. Then he started burying the evidence again, shoveling dirt over the container with desperate speed, covering the access port, covering the very existence of the vault. He worked until dawn, making sure the trench looked like nothing more than a freshly filled-in ditch. He even scattered pine needles and dead leaves over the surface to try and mimic the surrounding forest floor. When he finally stumbled back into the house, exhausted and shaking, he cleaned himself up and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the monitor cylinder. Elias had spent 50 years guarding a dormant secret. Alex had disturbed it, only to find it was already awake. He went straight back to Elias's study and pulled out the journal. He needed to find out what Project Chimera really was. What was Subject Zero? He flipped past the schematics and the catastrophe logs, searching for a description of the contents. Finally, he found a separate, heavily coded section titled Biological Component Acquisition. Elias had used euphemisms in the main log, but here the language was chillingly direct. The material, designated CZ-1, Chimera 01, was recovered from the Nevada desert after the 1967 meteorological event. It is non-terrestrial in origin. It exhibits properties of self-organization and high-level thermal regulation. Our initial hypothesis was that it was simply a complex mineral structure. We were wrong. Alex leaned closer, reading the next lines, written in a hand that was almost frantic. CZ-1 is a life form. It consumes ambient energy and uses standard atmospheric elements, nitrogen, oxygen, to grow. It is not hostile in the traditional sense, but its biological processes are destabilizing. It is growing slowly but relentlessly. We calculated that at a stable temperature and perfect containment, it would take 300 years to reach critical mass. If the temperature rises, or if containment fails, that timeline accelerates exponentially. The goal of the Obsidian Complex was not to study it, but to weaponize its self-organizing structure. They failed. The breach occurred because the heat generated by its accelerated growth during testing exceeded the capacity of the shielding. It absorbed the heat, grew, and then exerted massive kinetic force on the container walls. My job was to design a vault that would ensure 300 years of deep storage, preventing the world from knowing about the failed weapon and the living evidence of its existence. If it continues to grow, it will eventually crack the vault entirely, and whatever is inside will be released into the main ecosystem. Alex gripped the journal until his knuckles were white. Elias hadn't buried a secret. He had buried an alien organism, a slow-motion biological time bomb. And the integrity was compromised. The pressure was 0. The temperature was 78 degrees. Alex picked up the monitor cylinder again. If the temperature was 78 degrees, that meant the organism was actively generating heat, consuming energy, and growing. He needed to know the current growth rate. He needed data. He spent the next 2 days obsessively studying the engineering journal, trying to decipher the technical codes on the monitor. He learned that the cylinder wasn't just a basic sensor. It was a calibrated data logger, designed to record the organism's thermal output and kinetic pressure fluctuations. He found a diagram detailing how to extract the data using a specific interface, a heavy-duty external drive that Elias had referenced repeatedly. The drive, DSR-4, must be secured. It contains all the baseline data and the necessary software to interpret the telemetry from the deep storage unit. Without it, the monitor is useless, and we will be blind to the growth rate. Alex searched the study again, tearing apart the desk, the bookshelves, everything. He finally found it tucked behind a loose baseboard near the fireplace, a device the size of a small brick, heavy and old, with military-spec connectors. The DSR-4 data storage retriever. He connected the DSR-4 to the monitor cylinder. The cylinder whirred to life, and the DSR-4 began to blink rapidly, pulling decades of stored data. Alex watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, feeling the weight of the past 50 years pressing down on him. When the transfer was complete, the DSR-4 produced a single clear report on its tiny screen, summarizing the data analysis. Alex read the summary, and the blood drained from his face. The journal had projected 300 years until critical mass under perfect containment. The DSR-4 report was devastating. It showed that the containment breach had occurred shortly after Elias buried the vault, likely due to shifting earth or a flaw in the initial weld. The internal temperature had begun a slow, steady climb ever since. The final line of the summary was the one that mattered. Projection. Critical mass reached in approximately 18 months. 18 months, not 300 years. Alex looked out the window at the quiet, peaceful Maine forest. In a year and a half, the vault would fail completely, and an alien organism categorized as a failed weapon would be loose in the world. Elias had failed his mission, and now Alex had inherited the failure. He had to get the organism contained, or stabilized, or destroyed. But how? He was a construction worker, not a chief structural engineer or a biological weapons expert. He thought back to the journal. Elias had detailed the structural engineering, but he had mentioned other members of the team. The people in that faded black and white photograph. If Elias was the structural expert, someone else was the biological expert. Someone who might know how to neutralize CZ1. Alex pulled out the photograph again, 6 other faces, all looking triumphant in 1968. He needed to find them. He needed to find the Department of Advanced Containment, or what was left of it, and figure out how to stop Project Chimera before its clock ran out. He realized he couldn't do this alone. If he started asking questions about Project Chimera or the Obsidian Complex, he would immediately attract the attention of the government agency that had spent 50 years ensuring this stayed buried. The same agency that Elias had fled. He needed help, but it had to be discreet. He needed someone who specialized in finding ghosts, people who had disappeared into classified projects. He looked at the photograph again, zooming in on the faces with his phone camera. He focused on the only woman in the group. She had sharp eyes, and her name was scrawled faintly beneath her on the back of the photo. Next to Elias's note, Dr. Vivian Keller, Lead Biosystems. Alex had a name, a location, the Obsidian Complex, Nevada, and a deadline, 18 months. His quiet life in the Maine woods was over. He had to find Dr. Keller, or whoever was left of the Chimera team, and fast. He was no longer trying to solve his grandfather's secret. He was trying to prevent a global catastrophe, and the clock was ticking down to 0. The digging had stopped, but the real danger had just begun. Alex gripped the DSR-4, the cold metal digging into his palm. 18 months. That number didn't just represent a deadline, it was a countdown to global disaster, ticking away beneath the pine trees of his inherited property. His grandfather's 50 years of sacrifice had bought him almost nothing, thanks to a breach that happened God knows when. He couldn't stay. The house was a monument to a failed containment effort, and the land was now an active hazard zone. He had to leave Maine, but he couldn't just disappear. He went back out to the trench, confirming that the access port was buried deep, secured by the heavy rock he'd wedged against it. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would buy him time. He used the remaining loose dirt to make the area look naturally disturbed, like a spot where a curious bear had rooted around for grubs. Then he called Dale. "Hey, Dale, listen, something's come up," Alex said, trying to sound stressed but not panicked. "A family emergency down in Boston. I have to leave for a while, maybe a month." "Boston, huh? That's a long way from home, Alex," Dale replied, his voice thick with skepticism. "What about the septic line? We were supposed to start trenching the new spot tomorrow." "Put a hold on it," Alex insisted. "I'll pay you for the time you've already invested, plus a retainer. Just keep an eye on the place. Don't let anyone on the property, okay? Especially around the backwoods." Dale agreed, sounding grudgingly satisfied with the extra cash. Alex knew the contractor wouldn't ask too many questions as long as the money was good, but he also knew Dale was the kind of man who noticed things. If anyone came snooping, Dale would notice that too. Alex packed light. Clothes, cash, and the evidence. The journal, the ID card, the faded photograph, and the DSR-4. He wrapped them all tightly in a waterproof bag and secured it beneath the passenger seat of his pickup. He left the house looking abandoned, hoping that if anyone was watching, they'd think he'd simply given up on the fixer-upper and fled back to city life. He drove south, the oppressive weight of the Maine woods lifting slightly as he hit the interstate, but the weight of the secret replacing it, heavy and cold in his stomach. Finding Dr. Vivian Keller was his only lead. But how do you find a highly classified scientist who vanished 50 years ago? The government had erased her existence for a reason. He tried the usual tricks first, sitting in a cheap motel outside Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He used a burner laptop and a VPN. Google searches for Vivian Keller Project Chimera yielded nothing but academic papers on Greek mythology. Searching for Obsidian Complex, Nevada brought up pages about geology and old mining operations. He needed someone with access. Someone who knew how to dig through the digital dirt of government secrets. Alex had an old college friend, Marcus, who had gone into investigative journalism. Marcus was good, maybe too good. He specialized in exposing corporate fraud, but he had connections to the dark underbelly of information brokerage. Alex called Marcus from a payphone, minimizing his digital footprint. "Marcus, it's Alex Thorne. I need a favor. A big one. The kind of favor that makes you nervous." Marcus's voice was instantly guarded. "Alex, man, where have you been? You sound like you're calling from a bunker. What's the gig?" "It involves a cold case, government classified 1968. Nevada and Maine. I need to find a ghost, Dr. Vivian Keller." He heard Marcus sigh on the other end. "Alex, I deal with tax evasion, not UFO cover-ups. If this is that deep, you need a specialist." "Who?" Marcus hesitated. "There's a woman I know in Boston. She used to work for the National Archives. Got disillusioned. She runs a private research firm now, specializing in pre-digital era black projects. She's expensive, discreet, and terrifyingly good. Her name is Sarah Jennings. Meet her at the Boston Public Library Archives. Tell her Marcus sent you and that the code word is Obsidian." Alex drove straight to Boston. Sarah Jennings was nothing like the cloak and dagger operative Alex had imagined. She was mid-50s, sharp, dressed in tailored grey suits and wore reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked like a highly competent librarian, which, in a way, she was. They met in a quiet, dusty corner of the archive, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves of brittle, forgotten newspapers. "Marcus said you had a ghost for me, Alex," she said, her voice low and efficient. Alex pulled out the oilskin pouch and carefully presented the brass ID card and the faded photograph. "This is Elias Thorne, my grandfather, Chief Structural Engineer, Department of Advanced Containment, 1968. This is his team. I need to find Dr. Vivian Keller." Sarah didn't gasp or look shocked. She merely picked up the ID card with 2 fingers, turning it over to examine the official seal. "DAC," she murmured. "Advanced Containment. That's an old one. They were absorbed by a larger umbrella agency in the late 70s. They specialized in things that weren't supposed to exist." She looked at Alex over the rim of her glasses. "You didn't just find this ID, did you? You found what they were containing." Alex felt a chill, realizing how easily she saw through his facade. "I found a vault, 12 feet down, labeled Project Chimera. The containment has failed. The contents are active. I have about 18 months before it gets out." Sarah's expression finally shifted, hardening into professional focus. She didn't look scared, just intensely serious. 18 months? That's not a cold case, Alex. That's a sprint." She handed the items back. "We can't use standard channels. Any query regarding Project Chimera or Vivian Keller will trigger an immediate flag on the DAC's legacy systems. They keep a tight leash on their failures." She pulled out a small, thick tablet, seemingly innocuous. "I have access to back channels, old military personnel records, university enrollment archives, things that were digitized clumsily and never fully scrubbed." She worked for an hour in silence, her fingers flying across the screen. Alex watched the progress bar, feeling increasingly exposed in the public space. Finally, she leaned back, rubbing her temples. Vivian Keller, brilliant biosystems physicist. She disappeared from the official record in November 1968, exactly a month after the date on your grandfather's journal entry. The official story is that she died in a small plane crash over the Rockies. "But she didn't," Alex stated. "No, because I found her fingerprints. Not in the death registry, but in the records of a highly specialized non-public medical facility in Vermont, specializing in geriatric care under maximum discretion. She was admitted in 1998 for a long-term neurological condition, possibly stress-induced, and discharged 3 years ago." Alex leaned forward, adrenaline surging. "Discharged where?" "That's the hard part. They used a shell corporation to handle the transfer, but I found a property deed. A small farm, ironically, registered under the name V. Calloway, located deep in the Green Mountains of Vermont. High isolation, low population density. If she wanted to disappear, that's where she'd go." Sarah pulled up a satellite image of the property. a remote, snow-capped farm surrounded by dense woodland. It looked eerily familiar, just like Elias's place in Maine. "She's alive, Alex. V. Calloway is Vivian Keller." Alex let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank you, Sarah. What do I owe you?" "You owe me the truth about Project Chimera once you get it," she said, closing her tablet. "Now go. And be careful. If she's the last surviving member of that team, she's not just hiding from the world. She's hiding from the people who cleaned up the mess." As Alex stood up, ready to bolt for the door, the library's overhead lights flickered once, then settled back to normal. Sarah froze. Her eyes darted to a small hidden light on the side of her tablet. It was blinking a fast, urgent red. "What is it?" Alex asked, his heart sinking. "That's not normal," Sarah whispered, her voice tight. "My system just registered an external ping, a high-level trace attempt. It's highly encrypted, extremely fast, and it's targeting the query history I just ran on the DAC legacy server." "They found us?" "They found the data. They know someone is looking for Vivian Keller, and they know someone recently accessed records related to the Obsidian Complex and Deep Storage Protocol." Sarah quickly shut down her tablet, locking the data. "They're not waiting for a subpoena, Alex. They're running a live trace right now. They'll be able to triangulate this location within minutes." Alex felt the familiar cold knot of fear return, only this time it was mixed with the adrenaline of being actively hunted. Elias's paranoia hadn't been madness, it had been preparation. "You need to leave. Now," Sarah commanded, pushing him toward the exit. "Don't go back to your truck immediately. Walk, blend in. I'll scrub my systems as best I can, but they're likely already mobilizing." Alex didn't need to be told twice. He pushed his way out of the archives, through the grand halls of the library, and into the bustling streets of Copley Square. He walked fast, trying to lose himself in the crowd, the waterproof bag containing the key to the alien time bomb tucked under his arm. He knew what was coming. 50 years ago, the DAC had sent Elias into deep storage in Maine. Now, they were coming for Alex and for Dr. Keller. He managed to get back to his truck, parked several blocks away, before he saw the first sign of trouble. It wasn't a squad of uniformed officers, it was far more subtle. A sleek black SUV, the kind with heavily tinted windows that looked too clean for Boston traffic, was parked discreetly down the street. As Alex pulled away from the curb, he glanced in his rearview mirror. The black SUV pulled out, maintaining a measured distance behind him. They were already tracking him. Alex drove north, toward Vermont, his speed slightly over the limit, but not enough to draw police attention. He was racing against a government agency, and he was heading straight toward the only woman who might know how to neutralize Chimera 01. He spent the next few hours in a tense, silent drive through Massachusetts and into the rolling hills of Vermont. He tried evasive maneuvers, quick turns, speeding up, slowing down, but the black SUV stayed with him, a persistent, silent shadow. They weren't trying to pull him over, they were simply tracking him, waiting for him to lead them to their target. He realized he couldn't lead them straight to Vivian Keller. As he reached the outskirts of Montpelier, the capital of Vermont, Alex pulled into a massive, crowded supermarket parking lot, maneuvering his pickup into a spot near the back. The black SUV pulled in a few rows away. Two figures, indistinct behind the dark windows, seemed to be watching him. Alex grabbed his waterproof bag containing the evidence and the DSR-4. He didn't lock the truck. He just stepped out and headed toward the main entrance of the supermarket, trying to look like a man stopping for groceries. He walked past the automatic doors and into the produce section, his heart pounding. He could feel their eyes on him. He knew he had about 30 seconds before they realized he wasn't carrying a shopping basket. He spotted the secondary exit, a fire door leading out to the loading docks. He sprinted, pushing past a startled employee stacking crates of tomatoes. He burst through the fire door, triggering a sharp, loud alarm that echoed through the loading bay. He didn't look back. He jumped a low fence and plunged into the dense woods behind the supermarket. Running downhill toward a small river he could see glinting in the twilight. He heard shouts behind him, muffled by the alarm. They were out of the SUV. Alex ran, the steep, rocky terrain tearing at his lungs. He was a woodsman raised in the Maine wilderness. They were city operatives in expensive suits. He had the advantage, but it wouldn't last long. He reached the riverbank, a narrow, fast-flowing creek swollen with spring melt. He didn't hesitate. He jumped in, the shock of the freezing water stealing his breath. He waded across, scrambling onto the opposite bank, dripping wet and shivering. He ran for another 10 minutes deep into the forest, until he was sure the sound of the alarm and the shouts were long gone. He found a thicket of pines, hid beneath the low-hanging branches, and waited. He was safe for now, but his truck was compromised, and they knew he was looking for Dr. Keller. He pulled out his wet phone. He had downloaded the coordinates for V. Calloway's property before leaving Sarah. The farm was 20 miles away, deep in the mountains. He couldn't risk calling a taxi or walking the road. He needed a vehicle, and he needed to move fast. The DAC would be swarming the area by morning, setting up roadblocks and searching the woods. Alex pulled the DSR-4 out of the waterproof bag. The little device contained the terrifying truth about CZ-1. He looked at the photograph of Dr. Keller, her sharp eyes staring back at him from 1968. "Help me, Dr. Keller," he whispered. "I'm bringing you Elias's confession." He started walking, cutting cross-country through the dark, cold Vermont forest, heading toward the coordinates. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made him jump. He was no longer worried about 10 feet of dirt. He was worried about the shadowy agency that wanted to bury him alongside his grandfather's secret. It took him 6 hours of brutal hiking, scrambling over rocks and through icy streams, before he finally reached the general vicinity of the coordinates just before dawn. He found a barely maintained dirt road, even narrower and more isolated than the one leading to Elias's place. He followed it for another mile until he saw the faint outline of a small farmhouse nestled in a clearing. No fancy fence this time, but the isolation was absolute. He approached the house cautiously, sticking to the tree line. The air was still and cold. A single light burned in the kitchen window. He circled the house until he was at the back porch. He saw a small, familiar object leaning against the wall, a sturdy wooden cane, the kind his grandfather Elias used toward the end of his life. Alex took a deep breath and knocked softly on the back door. The light inside didn't change, but the sound of shuffling feet stopped abruptly. "Who is it?" a voice, aged but sharp, called out. It was a woman's voice, firm and unafraid. "My name is Alex Thorne," he said, keeping his voice low and respectful. "I am Elias Thorne's grandson. I have a message from 1968. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush him. Then the deadbolt slid back with a loud metallic thunk. The door opened slowly, revealing an elderly woman standing in the doorway. She was small, frail, but her eyes, the same sharp, intelligent eyes from the 1968 photograph, were focused on him with piercing intensity. Her white hair was pulled back tightly, and she wore a thick cardigan against the morning chill. "Elias?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Elias is dead." "Yes, ma'am," Alex confirmed. "He left me the house, and he left me Project Chimera." He held up the brass ID card so she could see the title, Chief Structural Engineer. Vivian Keller's eyes widened, not in surprise but in profound horror. She quickly scanned the dark woods behind him, as if expecting the black SUV to materialize from the shadows. "You dug, didn't you, boy?" she whispered, the accusation heavy. "I did. I know about CZ-1, I know about the breach, I know the clock is running out, 18 months. Vivian Keller didn't invite him in. She simply stepped aside, her face etched with 50 years of waiting. "They're coming, Alex. They always come when you start asking about Chimera." She looked at the small, wet bag in his hand. "Show me the data. Show me what Elias left us, and then we have to figure out how to stop the end of the world." Alex stepped across the threshold, entering the quiet, secure world of Dr. Vivian Keller. The room was warm, filled with the smell of wood smoke and old paper. The door slammed shut behind him, and the deadbolt slid into place. He was finally face to face with a member of the Chimera team, the only person left who might know how to destroy the alien organism. But Alex knew the DAC was closing in, and they were likely just hours behind him. Vivian pointed to a large wooden map covering the entire kitchen table. It wasn't a map of Vermont. It was a highly detailed, hand-drawn schematic of the Obsidian complex in Nevada, covered in cryptic annotations. "Elias and we always knew this day might come," she said, her voice regaining its professional strength. "He built the vault, but I designed the kill switch. But to activate it, We need to know where the other components are buried. She pointed to 3 distinct X marks scattered across the map of the Nevada desert. The DEC didn't just bury CZ-1 in Maine, Alex. They dispersed the supporting containment infrastructure, the stabilizing elements, to 3 separate locations across the country. We can't destroy the organism without activating those stabilizing elements first, and I have a feeling the DAC has been monitoring those sites closely for 50 years. Alex looked at the map, then at the clock on the kitchen wall. Dawn was breaking. We don't have time to travel across the country, Dr. Keller. They're tracking me. They know I'm looking for you. Vivian nodded grimly, her sharp eyes fixed on the map. Then we have to lure them out. We have to use their own surveillance against them. If they want to keep Chimera buried, they will protect those other sites at all costs. We need to hit them where they hurt, Alex. We need to create a distraction big enough to get us into those other vaults fast. She looked up at him, a determined fire in her eyes. Your grandfather failed to keep it buried. Now we have to finish his job. We have to bring the Chimera team back online. The moment Alex stepped inside, shutting the door on the cold Vermont morning, the world shrank down to that kitchen table and the woman staring at him. Vivian Keller was not just a scientist, she was a survivor, and her eyes held the same haunted determination that Elias's must have carried for 50 years. We don't have 18 months, Alex, Vivian said, her voice sharp as she pointed a frail finger at the map of the obsidian complex. If the integrity is compromised and the thermal signature is rising, the growth rate is exponential. We have maybe 6 months before the vault fails entirely. That's the real timeline. 6 months. That was the expert translation of Elias's vague warning. Alex quickly connected the DSR-4 data retriever to a heavy-duty military-spec laptop that Vivian pulled from a hidden cabinet. The laptop was old but powerful, designed to run the ancient DAC telemetry software. Elias designed the vault to hold, but I designed the organism to be contained, Vivian explained, pulling up complex diagrams on the screen. CZ-1 feeds on ambient energy. The 3 stabilizing elements, alpha, beta, and gamma, are massive electromagnetic dampeners. When activated remotely, they emit a synchronized counter-frequency pulse that starves CZ-1 of the energy it needs to grow. It doesn't kill it. It forces it into a state of deep molecular dormancy. She pointed to the 3 X marks on the hand-drawn map. When the project failed, the DAC decided to disperse all 4 components. Your grandfather took the most volatile piece, the core. The DAC took the 3 stabilizers and buried them in deep storage sites they already controlled. They are scattered across the country to prevent a single point of failure from releasing all 4 components simultaneously. Alex understood. The DAC was using the stabilizers as fail-safes against Elias's failure. They were guarding the stabilizers to prevent anyone from activating the kill switch. We need to activate all 3 simultaneously, or the core won't recognize the frequency, Vivian stated, and we need to do it without the DEC realizing our full plan. They're tracking me right now, Alex said, glancing at the window. They know where I was last seen. They'll be here soon. Then we use Elias's ghost to buy us time. Vivian's eyes gleamed with a strategist's fire. She pulled up the telemetry data from the DSR-4. The DAC monitors these sites constantly, looking for any sign of thermal fluctuation or unauthorized access. We can't physically get to the first site fast enough, but we can make them think the first site is already compromised. Working with surgical precision, Vivian hacked into the DAC's legacy communication protocols using the DSR-4 as a key. She spent 15 tense minutes coding a signal, a ghost transmission, designed to mimic a massive thermal spike and a kinetic pressure breach at stabilizer alpha, located in a remote part of the Arizona desert. That location is deep storage for highly volatile inert materials, Vivian explained as she hit the execute command. They will assume the desert heat has triggered a runaway thermal reaction. They will divert every available resource to Arizona to contain that false crisis. Alex watched the laptop screen as the transmission went out. A silent, powerful lie launched into the military ether. How long does that buy us? 48 hours, maybe less? Enough time to get to the first real stabilizer. We're going to hit the closest one next. Stabilizer Beta in upstate New York. They moved with the frantic efficiency of people who had been preparing for this moment for half a century. Vivian had a nondescript all-wheel drive pickup truck, old, muddy, and untraceable, parked in her barn. She had cash, fuel, and a detailed atlas marked with military exclusion zones. They drove non-stop, traversing back roads and avoiding major highways. Alex drove, his body aching from the night's hike, while Vivian, despite her age, remained alert, navigating and monitoring the DAC's communication chatter on her specialized laptop. 40 hours later, they were in the Adirondacks, deep within an old military reservation that had been decommissioned in the 1990s. Stabilizer Beta was buried beneath a crumbling concrete pad, 6 feet down. Elias's design was always about simplicity, Vivian noted, as Alex quickly located the vault using a handheld military GPS unit that Vivian had brought. The stabilizers are designed to be retrieved, unlike the core. They're only 6 feet down. Alex, now an expert excavator, used a powerful, battery-operated drill to breach the concrete and then shoveled away the dirt. Within an hour, they exposed a smaller, but still formidable, steel vault. Vivian produced a small, silver device, her custom activation key. She plugged it into an exposed port on the stabilizer vault. A faint green light pulsed. "Activated," she whispered, relief washing over her face. 1 down, 2 to go. But the relief was short-lived. As they were covering the hole, Vivian's laptop screamed a silent warning. "They've realized the Arizona spike was a decoy," she said, her voice strained. "They found the residual telemetry signature from our transmission. They know we're active and they know we're working the stabilizers. They're prioritizing the remaining 2 sites. The third stabilizer, Gamma, was located in an isolated region of the Utah desert. Getting there would take another day of driving, time they didn't have if the DAC was already mobilizing. They'll secure Gamma first," Alex realized. "It's the most remote. They'll expect us to hit the closest one next, the one we just activated." "No," Vivian countered, shaking her head firmly. "We go for Gamma. They will expect us to try and activate all 3. But we don't need all 3. Elias and I always knew the Beta and Gamma were the most powerful. They were designed to work in tandem if the Alpha was lost." They drove relentlessly, fueling up at tiny gas stations, barely sleeping. The chase was on, a desperate race across the country. As they approached the Utah site, a flat, desolate expanse of baked earth surrounded by low, jagged mountains, Vivian's laptop showed 3 distinct heat signatures arriving at the location. "They beat us," Alex muttered, gripping the steering wheel. "No, they're waiting for us," Vivian corrected. "They won't activate the stabilizers themselves. That would draw too much attention. They just need to prevent us from doing it." They parked the truck 5 miles away and proceeded on foot, moving through the desert canyons under the cover of a massive dark sky. When they finally reached the designated area, they saw the DAC presence, 3 black SUVs parked around a newly erected temporary military tent. Several figures in dark tactical gear were patrolling the perimeter. "Containment specialists," Vivian confirmed, peering through binoculars. "They won't shoot to kill, Alex. They'll shoot to incapacitate and retrieve. We are evidence and they want us alive." Alex, however, was done being retrieved. He had an alien organism pulsing beneath his house, and he had 6 months to stop it. "Where is the vault?" Alex asked. "Under the center of that tent. They're guarding it." They needed a distraction that would pull the specialists away from the stabilizer vault for precisely 3 minutes, enough time for Vivian to plug in her device. Alex looked around the desolate landscape. "We can't fight them, but we can make them think they have a bigger problem." He remembered the journal's details about the DAC's obsession with thermal stability. He pulled out the DSR-4. "The DAC uses localized thermal sensors to monitor the stabilizers. If I can mimic a massive localized thermal spike right outside the perimeter, they'll assume the stabilizer is failing and pull back to establish a safe zone." Using a combination of the DSR-4 and a small high-powered directional antenna Vivian had brought, Alex broadcast a massive, false thermal signature spike right where the specialists were standing. The effect was instantaneous. A loud electronic alarm blared from the tent. The specialists immediately dropped their patrol and converged on the tent, shouting orders into their radios. "Go," Alex urged. He and Vivian sprinted toward the confusion. Alex provided cover, throwing rocks to simulate movement in the opposite direction. Vivian, moving with surprising speed, ducked under the perimeter tape and scrambled toward the tent. She lifted the flap and disappeared inside. Alex watched, heart pounding, as the DAC specialists, now led by a tall, rigid man in a dark suit, started shouting about a Level 3 containment breach. "It's a false reading," the leader yelled into his radio. "It's localized interference. Find the source." The leader spotted Alex hiding behind a boulder. Before Alex could move, the DAC operative leveled a sophisticated, non-lethal weapon at him, a device that looked like a large flashlight. "Stop right there, Mr. Thorne. You are interfering with a classified operation," the leader barked. "You're too late," Alex shouted back. "The containment failed 50 years ago. You just buried the evidence." The leader ignored him, firing the weapon. A sharp, invisible pulse hit Alex, knocking the breath from his lungs and sending him sprawling into the dirt. He felt momentarily stunned, but his body was tough, conditioned by years in the Maine woods. He forced himself up, grabbing the DSR-4 he'd dropped. He saw Vivian emerging from the tent, her face pale but triumphant. The silver device was still in her hand, its green light pulsing steadily. "Done, Alex. Beta and Gamma are active. Let's go." The leader of the DAC team realized what had happened. "She activated the stabilizers. Secure the perimeter, retrieve the subjects." Alex and Vivian ran, plunging into the darkness of the canyons. The DAC agents, hampered by their heavy gear and the difficult terrain, couldn't keep up. They drove for another day, only stopping when they were finally out of the desert and back on the highways, heading east. "It's done," Vivian said simply, staring at the green light on her device. "The frequency pulse is synchronizing. We need to get back to Maine immediately. The synchronization won't last long." The final leg of the journey was the hardest. They drove straight through, Alex running on pure adrenaline and the knowledge that the fate of the world literally rested beneath his pine trees. They arrived back at Elias's farm in Maine 2 days later. The place was quiet. Dale, the contractor, hadn't been back. The woods were still. Alex and Vivian went straight to the burial site. Alex grabbed a shovel and started digging, this time with a grim sense of destiny. They reached the massive green vault, 12 feet down. The air was heavy, and the faint, low thump was noticeably louder now, faster, almost frantic. CZ-1 was reacting to the activation of the stabilizers. It was panicked. Alex cleared the access port, and with Vivian watching, removed the heavy rock and the small round plate. He aimed the headlamp inside. The fibrous mesh cocoon was vibrating rapidly, and the oily purple-black material visible through the tear was shimmering violently. The thermal output was spiking. "It's resisting the pulse," Vivian cried, leaning over the hole, her voice urgent. "The frequency is hitting it, starving it of energy, but it's fighting back. It's trying to accelerate its growth to break containment before it starves." "What do we do?" Alex asked, terrified. "We need to amplify the pulse. We need to feed the stabilizer frequency directly into the core through the access port." Vivian produced a final small component, a highly specialized emitter designed to focus the stabilizing frequency. It was meant to be attached to the DSR-4. "This is the kill switch, Alex. Elias gave me the blueprints for the emitter decades ago. I built it myself. Attach the DSR-4 to the emitter, point it into the port, and activate the final sequence. It will overload the system and force CZ-1 into molecular stasis." Alex took the emitter, his hands trembling. He fitted the DSR-4 into the socket, turning the assembly into a strange, futuristic weapon. He knelt at the edge of the hole, pointed the device into the dark cavity, and hit the final, recessed button on the DSR-4. The emitter didn't make a sound, but a visible wave of blue energy shot from the nozzle, plunging into the vault. Inside the container, the frantic thumping stopped instantly. The shimmering purple-black material went dark. The thermal reading dropped. The sound of resistance vanished, replaced by a deep, absolute silence, a silence far more profound than the one Elias had left behind. Alex held the emitter steady for a full minute until the blue light faded. He lowered the device, his arms shaking with exhaustion. Is it done? Vivian knelt beside him, peering into the hole. She pulled a small sensor from her pocket and dropped it into the cavity. It beeped softly. Thermal reading, 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Kinetic pressure, 0. Biological activity, negligible. Vivian looked up at Alex, her eyes shining with tears that she quickly wiped away. It's dormant, Alex. The Chimera is asleep. We won. They spent the rest of the day resealing the vault, using industrial epoxy and the remaining dirt to make the area look undisturbed. They didn't bury it 12 feet deep. They buried it deep, ensuring that no accidental digging would ever find the access port again. The DAC never came to Maine. The false thermal spike they had launched in Arizona had caused such a massive internal panic and reallocation of resources that the resulting chaos bought Alex and Vivian the time they needed. The 3 black SUVs in Utah were found abandoned, and the DAC had to spend weeks cleaning up their own mess. Unable to publicly acknowledge the true nature of their pursuit, Vivian Keller, the brilliant biosystems physicist, decided to stay in Maine. She moved into Elias's old house, claiming it was the only place in the world where she felt safe. She became the new guardian, setting up a specialized low-frequency monitoring system, hidden, of course, to ensure CZ-1 stayed dormant. Elias didn't leave you land, Alex, Vivian told him one evening, sitting on the porch swing, watching the Maine fog roll in just as Elias used to. He left you a mission. He knew the time would come when the vault would fail, and he needed someone young, someone outside the system, to finish his life's work. Alex spent a week helping Vivian settle in, repairing the house properly, and installing her new monitoring equipment. He took the journal, the DSR-4, and the photograph, securing them in a new, hidden safe. He was no longer just Alex Thorne, the grandson. He was the keeper of the world's most dangerous secret. When he finally drove away from the remote property, he looked back at the house, seeing Vivian on the swing, a quiet sentinel against the encroaching darkness. Alex didn't go back to his old life. He couldn't. He used the money Elias left him to start a specialized consulting firm, one that dealt with remote excavation and structural integrity. He learned how to spot the signs of deep storage, the faint geological anomalies that betrayed government secrets. He was still digging, but now he was digging for knowledge, preparing for the day the DAC might try to retrieve their failed weapon. He never dug past 10 feet again. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what lay beneath the quiet earth of his grandfather's farm. 12 feet down, resting in a deep sleep, was the silence of a catastrophe averted. And every time the wind sighed through the pines, Alex knew that the quiet ones, the ones who kept the heaviest secrets, were truly the ones who held the world together. The legacy of Elias Thorne wasn't the land. It was the peace he finally secured, 12 feet beneath the surface.